ARE Podcast, episode number 40.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. ARE Podcast, where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to another episode of the ARE Podcast. And right off the bat, I'm going to explain. This is episode number 40, and you might be thinking, well, what happened to, season 1 episode, whatever we left on? And
I actually am thinking.
I know Eric's wondering about that. It was such a brilliant idea when I had it. We would do different seasons and, take breaks between the year. And I think we were on season 1 for like 2 years, and it just didn't work. So we tried it, and it didn't work. So we're going to our regular episode numbers, and I had to go back and renumber all the episodes. So yeah, episode number 40. This is called How Cognitive Bias is Keeping You from Passing the AREs. And if you're wondering what that means, you're not alone, because I am too. And that's what Eric is going to explain to us, because he is the brainiac of the two of us. So
boy, are we in trouble then.
Welcome, Eric. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Are you excited for 2018?
I am very excited for 2018 because 2017 went by way too quick. It went by in a flash, and it seemed like everything was occupied with politics and not actually getting anything done.
Exactly.
But anyway.
And I know I didn't finish as strongly as I would like. The Instagram feed was a little sparse the last couple of months. We did get some giveaways in there, but if you haven't already, you can follow us at Architect Prep. Over there on Instagram, that's where we're doing our weekly giveaways, which we're going to start back up next week. And also any updates on the release of our materials 5.0. As you know, or as you should know by now, NCARB is retiring 4.0 in June. So a lot of flurrying going on, I think, with ARE candidates. And I think that's what makes today's topic, even though I'm not sure what it's about because I don't understand it, but I'm sure it's relevant to what we're about to talk about.
Well, here's what the topic is, basically. How it's after talking to hundreds and hundreds of candidates, because we have these free calls that we do, and I do them every day. I've just seen these repeating assumptions going on, and so if you do something enough times, you start to put it into categories. And so what this topic really is how your own brain is keeping you from passing. That's really what it's about.
And we've talked about this before, about how mental this process is. And if you haven't already, head over onto the website. I won't give you the link address because it might change when we redo our website. But you can get a free call with Eric. You'll see it in the sidebar there. 15-minute free call. You can schedule that all online and talk to Eric and talk to him about your concerns, whether it's specific about a division or it's some mental block you're having or you're scared about 4.0 retiring. Eric is there to talk to you. He's not available every day. He likes to claim he is, but he's got his work hours. I think you're off on the weekend from talking to candidates, right? Unless you see him at some seminar.
Well, for the free calls, I think it's set up to only do it during the week. Yeah, but I do it 7 days a week.
Oh well, there you go. But
by the way, in case you're wondering why these aren't calls with David and Eric, it's because David hates the phone. That's why. He was beaten by a phone as a child, I think, and he's been deathly afraid of it ever since.
If I could do these calls versus text messaging, I would be happy. If I could podcast via text messaging, I would be happy. But technology's not there yet. So here we are with how our brain essentially is keeping us from either passing the ARE, starting the ARE, dragging it out for us. As you may or may not know, it took me 7 years to complete this process. It was before the 5-year rolling clock. Eric, you did it in something like 16 or 19 weeks. Which one was it?
18. There were 9 divisions, so 18 weeks.
18 weeks. So, So Eric brings that getting prepared and we're gonna talk about that. So you've talked to hundreds of candidates, because I think we've been doing these free calls for over a year. I think we did them all 2017, right?
Yeah, we started at the end of January, so we're coming up on a year now, and it was kind of an experiment, and I have to admit I started loving it. They're only 15 minutes, and what I found is that in 15 minutes I can actually really help people, and it also it's given us great insight into how to make our study materials better, and just hearing the problems that they're facing is helps me better kind of with everything, with looking at the podcast, with looking at the materials, and figuring out how to explain something to a candidate. It's great.
And I know you do love the process. You love talking to the candidates, and I think you and I have talked about this before offline, that I think you were surprised initially at how much or how few calls related to, say, specifics of the material of I don't understand this versus how do I prepare for this thing, or what kind of basically mental advice can you give me?
Yeah. I guess I kind of thought most of the calls would be, okay, explain to me how substantial completion works, or something like that. And I do get those, but they're probably only 1 in 10 calls is like that. Most of the calls are, I'm freaked out. Do I do 4.0 or 5.0? How do I choose? I'm really worried about it. It's a lot of, I listen and hear a lot of fear words in their voice. And from that's why we did a podcast on mindset, if you remember, for that very reason. So this podcast has really come out about, I've been talking to these candidates, and these are great candidates. They're clearly smart, and they're not passing, and it's not because of their lack of commitment. It's not because of their lack of studying. It's not because of their lack of professional experience. They're not passing because of something else. So they end up calling me to find out why. And so as I've just been asking them, well, how are you studying? How are you doing this? How are you doing that? I've observed that they have these mental blocks, and by definition, these mental blocks are known as cognitive biases. And
these mental blocks, are these coming from fear? Like, what is if there is one main reason behind these mental blocks, or maybe it's 3 or 4, what stands out in your mind of why these mental blocks are happening? Because it sounds like it's not because I'm lazy. It's not because I don't want to do the work. Especially the candidates who are reaching out to you are taking the initiative to schedule the call, which is very easy to do, but it's a roadblock, right? So they're getting over that roadblock. They're taking the time. And, they're admitting to you that I need help, like, help me. And we're not good as humans asking for help.
Of course, I've encountered lazy candidates. Luckily there aren't that many, but I've encountered them. The ones that go, I went in, took the test, I didn't really study, and I'm surprised I failed. Why did I fail? Well, you failed because you didn't study. Then there are the candidates that have they have an attitude about it. I hate NCARB. I hate the tests. They're stupid. They're a waste of time. I don't need this. Those people are always going to fail until they change their mindset. But then there are these candidates that really work hard and come out of there thinking they did well, but didn't, and they don't know why. And as I've talked to them more and more, I've kind of pinpointed exactly what they're doing, and it falls into this bucket of they have these cognitive biases. And I should say, I started working with these cognitive biases 2 years ago when I was doing all that work with the X Prize Foundation. And basically, the X Prize Foundation says they pose these beautiful questions. They say, okay, look at a problem and ask what needs to be invented that hasn't been invented. What needs to be developed that nobody's developing, and why aren't they? And one of the exercises that we do with the X Prize Foundation is we go through what are the biases I have. And so if I'm looking at a sustainability problem, one of the biases I might have is that I assume that I always need to invent something as opposed to using what's already there. I was already aware of these kind of cognitive biases going into this. It was already kind of at the top of my mind, which ironically is another form of a cognitive bias.
So let me just stop you there, because what I want to clear up, and I'm clearing this up for myself as well, when we're talking cognitive bias, we're talking about basically the baggage our brain brings with us. We're not talking about mindset. We're not talking about whether it's a negative mindset or a positive mindset. That is different. A negative mindset, like you mentioned, some candidates have, and they wonder why they fail. And it's interesting because it sounds like the group of candidates we're talking about now with this cognitive bias are kind of doing everything right. They're putting the time in, they're studying, they have the positive mindset. And now what you are saying, or what you are finding, it's the cognitive bias, which is, I guess, is it the baggage that the brain brings along with us? Is that somehow impeding our success?
That's exactly it. So cognitive bias, by definition, are the shortcuts that we make in our own thinking that let us make faster decisions. And in many ways, cognitive biases are good, right? If I were to say, hey, where do you want to go for lunch? If you were to take 3 hours to figure out, do I want Thai food or Japanese food or Italian food? And it took you 3 hours, then you'd miss lunch. So in a certain sense, we've trained our brain to make these quick decisions, but in doing so, we've created these shortcut pathways. Sometimes cognitive biases are bad, like examples of prejudice or racism or sexism. And that's really somebody who goes, who has these preconceived notions about somebody. But really, it goes back to that old grade school adage of when your teacher would say, never assume or you make an ass out of you and me. Remember that whole game? And they'd divvy up the word? Exactly. It's basically that. And these cognitive biases can limit us as designers when we start designing the same things over and over again. And we fail to question these things. And if you think about the history of architecture, the examples of genius in architecture throughout history have really been architects who've broken through and overcome these biases and questioned these existing paradigms. So what Frank Lloyd Wright did with the American House, or what Mies did with the office building, that was overcoming an existing paradigm that was its own cognitive bias.
So then these cognitive biases, we all have them, right? We don't have a choice of whether we have them. They're much like feelings, whether we feel happy or sad, the feelings are coming. It's how we take those feelings and move forward, much how we take the biases and move forward. But it seems, because we're talking about the brain, which of course is complex, with these cognitive biases, oftentimes we don't even know we have them.
Right. So the biases help us make decisions, and they really help us address 4 things. First, they help us address if there's just too much information given to us. We only have 5 senses. We only have a limited amount of time. So if there's too much information, a cognitive bias will help us make a snap decision about it. Second would be if there's not enough meaning. The brain has a way of kind of filling in the dots or the gaps if it's not provided with enough information. And a cognitive bias there can help us kind of move ahead. Third, when there's not enough time or there's not enough resources, like it's trying to decide where you want to go for lunch. And then fourth, we have a bias when we don't have enough memory. We don't remember everything. We choose what to remember. And some of us are better at remembering than others, but generally we have a limited hard drive on our heads. And so cognitive biases also help us make those shortcuts in decision. We're not going to remember every meal we've ever had, or even if we've eaten at that restaurant before, but we can use these decision-making processes to make a quick decision.
So it sounds like, for purposes of the exam, we know we're going to be dealing with our own cognitive bias. As a prerequisite to kind of tackling this cognitive bias, we need to have a positive mindset. Because I would imagine if we go into the exam with a negative mindset, then it's just going to kind of make any cognitive bias that comes into play. It's just going to continue to go off the rails. It seems like. Like, what's the relationship between the mindset?
Well, I tend to think if you have a negative mindset towards the AREs, you're probably not going to pass anyway.
Right.
Regardless of whether you studied or not. This is different. These are people that are really studying, and what really kicked it off was I spoke to a guy. He's doing the 3 exams under 4.0, and then he wants to do the rest under 5.0, which a lot of people are doing. He passed SPD. He passed CDS, and then he got to PPP, and he's failed it now 3 times. He wasn't using our study materials, by the way. I should say that. He was using a different company's study materials, but found that we were doing these calls, and he's like, I'm at my wit's end. I'm studying hard. I'm really dedicated to this. I passed the first 2, no problem. What am I doing wrong? And I said, well, do you know what area? What's your score report say? What areas were you weak in? And he said sustainability and codes. And I said, well, what do you do all day? And he said, I do healthcare remodels, like tenant TI type work for healthcare. And I said, well, do you have an example of a category of a question that confused you? And he said, yeah, it was probably in sustainability. They asked me a question about life cycle assessment, and I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And I said, what do you do all day again? And he said, I select wall coverings and paint colors for drywall, essentially. And I said, I'm starting to see the problem. He was looking at that problem about life cycle assessment, which is really a green building question, and he was looking at it through the lens of, I'm a healthcare architect. And so he answered something to do with drywall or concrete, which are not very life cycle friendly materials. And he just had this, he said, a mental block to it. I said, it's not a mental block. You have a bias. You're framing every question from your perspective as a guy who does healthcare architecture all day. I said, and so I coached him on how not to do that. But it's kind of a good example of how his own wiring, which helps him out every day during his job, was actually working against him.
All right, so he sounds like a lot of us candidates. I mean, he does not sound unique in the sense that, we have experience in one building type or one project type, and the ARE is, a breadth of knowledge that might encompass various, project types. So I understand how his bias, or let's call it his experience, holds him back a little bit. But how do you, or I guess specifically, how do you coach him? Like, how do you train yourself? Oh, I shouldn't look at it like that. How do I train myself to look at it the right way?
Well, his was the first. His was the first that kind of clued me into this. Because I said, and all that was really checking out. It just came back to, he said, well, I've never really done any work in sustainability or codes, but I studied it. But I'm not getting it, and I don't know why. And so as I kept grilling him with questions, it kind of clued me in. And then as I was meeting with other candidates, because remember, every day I'm talking to, anywhere from 1 to 4 of them, it kind of made me realize that this was a persistent thing. Now, cognitive bias affects us all every day, and sometimes you can't even control it. There's everybody's had this thing where they'll learn a new term or a word, or they'll learn a new concept. A friend will tell them, and they'll start seeing it everywhere.
Right.
It's like when I first drank kombucha, and then suddenly kombucha was everywhere.
Exactly.
And by the way, if you don't know what kombucha is, now you will, because you'll start seeing it everywhere. And that's a normal thing. That's a cognitive bias, right? Suddenly now it's in our pathway, and we're almost looking for it. But then we also have this anchoring effect. You see this every day. Apple does this really well, where they set a price of an iTunes song at 99 cents, so it kind of anchored that was the price that everybody else had to be. You'll see used car dealers will do this as a point of negotiation. They'll start high and then work down, so it seems like you've gotten a really good deal because they've anchored it at a very, very high level.
Right.
It happens with salary negotiations, right? They start low and then go up and go, listen, I've already come $20,000 from where we started. So we have these cognitive biases every day, but in with the AREs, I've identified that there are dozens of biases that all these candidates are showing, and not every candidate is doing all of them. But I want to go through the list and listen to see if any of these biases are affecting you or could be affecting you. Does that sound good?
Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
And then I still want to hear how you're going to help me get over my cognitive bias, but
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. But first, there's a bunch of small biases, and we all do this, and it might be okay to even do this a little bit. But there's, for instance, a time bias, right? Where we have this mental idea that quicker is better or faster is better. And while this might have been true on maybe the vignettes under 4.0, this is not necessarily so true under 5.0 and the case studies, where you really kind of like have to dig and unpack to get to the answer they're asking about. There's another bias that comes up all the time, and David, you see this all the time, which is the old NCARB's out to get me bias, right?
Right.
The candidate just assumes that NCARB's trying to trick them. It's in psychology, it's called the reverse halo effect, where they assume NCARB is this evil empire, which they're not. They're nice people.
Let me stop you right there, though, because that is interesting. Because when I think of NCARB's out to get me, I automatically, just in my mind, associate that with negative mindset. But that doesn't have to be. Like, somebody could have a very positive mindset and still like legitimately feel NCARB is out to trick me. So that's the bias.
And how would you think you'd read the question thinking NCARB's trying to trick me, so I'm going to scrutinize every word in the wrong way? It becomes a mental shortcut that's working against you. Yeah, it's a trust thing, right? There's this idea that I don't trust them. Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. There's another bias. I call it the I'm right, they're wrong bias. You and I get this every day. Countless candidates who assume that something that they're not understanding must be a typo, must be something wrong in our materials. I've had candidates tell me that there was a typo in the NCARB exam, in the actual exam, which it's a form of egocentrism. Basically, it's this bias that I must be right, so therefore by default everybody else is wrong. Right. It's weird how quick people are to jump to that. Right. Although now that's not. Yeah, just because not to say we do have typos and things in our study guides, and when they're brought to attention, we try and correct them. But it's the attitude that it comes across with, for sure. Right. A common one, and this will probably occur to a lot of people, is there's a very strong regional bias. They spent their whole life, school, and career in one place, and so they go, well, we do it this way here in Alabama, and the test is not tailored to regions. It's the same test for everybody. Right. And so they're looking at it from how we do it in Alabama versus how we probably do it on a national stage. Well, let me let's see what else. Before you get into that next one, one way I'll use the California supplemental exam as an example, because those of you in California have to do this exam after you do the ARE. But what I tell candidates at the seminars for the CSE is you can't think of this exam as you're an employee. That's just not going to work. Like, you have to step outside of that. You have to put yourself in the shoes of a firm owner or a principal, and that's how you have to think about these decisions. I think similar to kind of what we're talking about here, you have to step outside of Alabama or whatever kind of bias you're bringing to it. You have to somehow figure out how to look at this with an open mind. And I tell candidates this at the CSE, don't assume things in a question that aren't there. Don't go add things to the question that aren't there. And candidates do it all the time, and I think the ARE too. And that, I guess that's that we're talking about this. That's our cognitive bias, adding things to the question. Yes. Yeah. I'll have candidates that'll give me a hypothetical question, and I'll say, well, okay, think out loud. Tell me your thought process, and they will just go off on this, the contractor had eggs that morning, and he doesn't like eggs, and it's like, whoa, where did all that come from? Right. That was not in the question at all. Right. I think one of the things that I tell almost every candidate now on the phone is that NCARB's not out to get you. In fact, NCARB doesn't even know who you are, basically. the test you're getting is the test that everybody's getting, and you really need to kind of own that and accept it. But there's I have a few more biases.
Yeah, keep going on our list.
Okay, so there's this very real one I call it a framing bias, and this one occurs, like, let's say you get asked a sustainability question right after you get a really intense contract question or a structures question. It's going to force you to look at that next question as if they're related, but they're not. You're getting the questions randomly. But if you happen to get a sustainability question asked right after a contract question, you're going to be looking at that sustainability question almost through that same lens, especially if that previous question was a hard one.
Right.
And it's not that. The test it's a computer randomly generating question. It's a bank of questions it's pulling randomly. And I often wonder if somebody would have gotten a question right if they were asked it first.
So then, we'll actually keep going through your list here because I have a couple questions.
I have two more little ones, and these ones I've just picked up on talking to people. One is what I call the hot streak bias. It's also known as the hot hand fallacy in basketball, which is like I won the last two games, therefore I'm going to win the next two games. How many times have you heard a candidate say, I passed the last two tests no problem, so I expect to pass the next one?
Right.
That mindset is great, but it can also work against you. I failed the last two tests. I'm probably going to fail this one. I can't tell you how many times I hear that. Right. What does SPD and PPD have to do with CDS that you're about to take? It doesn't really. If you're studying for each one is its own autonomous thing. And it's a phenomenon you see in gamblers and stockbrokers all the time. This hot hand idea, right? I'm on a streak. It's crap. You're each test you're studying for and taking individually.
So then, if we, this is interesting. So let's take this for a second. This idea that I do well in two exams, I'm going to do well in the third exam, not necessarily. It's almost like I did. If we take one exam, I did well on these three questions. I'm going to do well on the fourth question, not necessarily. And it's almost like, if what I'm hearing correctly, to sort of work with the bias that we have, we can't eliminate these cognitive biases. They're in our head. It's how we use them. Right. It's almost like each question we have to look at like it's the first time we're seeing a question like that day. It's like we have to forget if it's question 95. We have to forget we've seen 94 questions. This is the first time I'm seeing a question today. Every question.
94 questions in a row. The 95th one, we have to look at each question afresh.
All right. So if we have 94, questions in a row, we have to somehow block that out. And the 95th question, it's like the first question we're seeing today.
And especially remember the way the NCARB is graded. You have to earn points to pass each item, especially under 5.0. Each item's worth of 1 point, and you have to rack up a certain number of points to pass. So each item is an opportunity for you to earn one more point. And so you need to almost look at each one on its own and forget about what you just came through.
It's almost like you have to. It's almost like you have to go into meditation. You have to be very like Buddha, like very Zen-like. And just let question number 8 flow into me, and you take that question and you do what you do with it, and then just let it go and release it. And then question 9 comes into me, just let it go. And you just let it go and release it. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, it's it is a lot like that, which kind of leads us to the last small bias that we all suffer from. And this one I called the bizarro effect, or the bizarreness effect. What I've discovered with candidates is they have a much easier time remembering the weird stuff than the boring stuff.
Right.
Bizarre material is easier to remember than common material. And this is one of the reasons why you and I put jokes into the study guide, because the jokes help them remember stuff, or why we put fun facts throughout our study guides is because that little analogy of that story thing helps them remember it in the test. That was kind of our not so secret reason for doing it. But that bizarreness effect also works against you, because if you perceive the material as boring, you are going to have a harder time remembering it and summoning it when you're in the exam.
Well, it's also the candidates I've heard from the ARE and also the CSE. There's some candidates, when they fail, every question was convoluted and every question was difficult and every question was really hard to understand. It's just not true. It's just not true. That's what they remember. That's the memory of their experience. But my guess is probably 3/4 of the questions were half to 3/4, whether it's CSE or ARE, are probably fairly straightforward. And then there's the other quarter to half that are tricky. But they walk away thinking all 100 questions were tricky.
Yeah, and what's funny is that I'd mentioned this woman before. I talked to a woman who she had taken, I think it was PPP 11 times, and she didn't want to move forward to another exam until she passed PPP. Like it was by the way, also not using our material previously. She had discovered us. And then so we started talking about these biases, and that was a question of mindset. She had after 11 failed attempts for the same division, her attitude was NCARB's stupid, NCARB's evil. They don't even know you. You're taking the same test everybody does. And once I kind of gave her a little tough love with the mindset, she took the test 2 weeks later using our material and passed. And I'm not saying that in a bragging way. I don't even think it was the material. I think it was just her mindset was finally right.
Well, yeah, especially, and if she took it 11 times, she had to be pretty familiar with the content of the material. Not necessarily what's on the exam, but, if she studied 11 times or pseudo-studied for 11 times, like the knowledge has to be in there somewhere, and I guess she had trouble getting it out. Maybe is less the mindset and more the cognitive bias.
Yes, exactly. So, which leads us to what I've identified as 3 really big biases. The other biases I mentioned, they probably affect all of us to some degree, and that's normal. But there are 3 big ones that if you're suffering from these, I think that they would be somewhat fatal in your grade, not to your health, but to your passing grade. And the first one is what I had already mentioned before, this project type bias. If you're doing healthcare tenant improvement stuff all day long, and that's the bulk of your experience, and you suddenly get asked a question about sustainability and life cycle assessment, you're probably not going to look at that question afresh and in the right way. You tend to frame it that every project, it must be the type that you're already working on, and I'm telling you about these won't easily overcome, knowing that you might be suffering from this.
You cut out there for a second. So what I want to say about that is the bias. Let's say, okay, I have this healthcare experience. I get a question about sustainability. I'm looking at the sustainability question from my healthcare experience point of view. And what you're saying is that could be the incorrect way, and probably the incorrect way to look at it. It's not that the question or the knowledge is rocket science or difficult. It's just because we're not allowing ourselves to look at it fresh. We're bringing in our hospital experience to it. Is that what you're saying? Because I just want to be clear, because we have healthcare experience doesn't mean we're going to have trouble with sustainability. Like, we don't have to necessarily have the firm experience to be able to answer sustainability questions. We can learn that, right?
Right. So what I did was, with that guy, I gave him a sample question from our exam simulator about life cycle assessment. And I forget the exact question, but it was basically if you're worried about life cycle assessment, which material would be the best to choose? That was roughly the question.
Right.
And answer A was drywall and concrete. Answer B was bamboo and cork. Answer C was something else. And so he answered A. And I'm like, no, do you know why? And I'm talking him through. And he said, well, because drywall is everywhere and everybody knows how to use it and it's ubiquitous. And it was the exact wrong thing. And I said, what do you do all day? And he's like, I put up essentially spec drywall all day.
Right.
And when I explained, look at the words within the question, the clue word about, lowering life cycle impact, life cycle assessment, drywall requires immense amount of material, raw material, immense amount of energy to make it, and then it's shipped from far away. It is actually the worst material on that list in terms of life cycle. I didn't want to just teach him about that one point about life cycle assessment. I wanted to teach him about how his own bias of being a healthcare architect was affecting his view of the question.
So you're saying because he had so much familiarity with drywall and concrete, that's what he knew, right? Let's say that's what he was an expert in. He sees this life cycle question, and probably not fully understanding what a life cycle assessment is. But seeing the drywall and concrete, like, well, yeah, I have a lot of experience with that. That sounds like a good one. So I'm going to pick that.
Yeah. Another way of looking at it is if you're a hammer, everything to you is going to look like a nail. That's kind of probably the better way to do it.
That's actually a great analogy. So you have a bunch of nails and you have screws. Screws look like nails unless you get sort of close enough and you look at them, and you can't hammer a screw. That's actually, you should have said that at the top of the podcast.
Oh, shoot. I should have rewind everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the first big bias that could really backfire against you. The second one, and this one comes up a lot, and I call it the self-centric bias, that you frame every question relative to you. Maybe we call it the Donald Trump bias, but it's basically everything is taken from your perspective and your past experience. Another way to say it would be that when you read a scenario in the question, you imagine every client as a white male, just like you, or you imagine every client like the one that you already have. And it is a bias, and it almost forces you into an answer before you've even actually started to dissect the question.
Well, what do you call it, self-centric?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the one that might be most detrimental. I'm thinking just my experience with CSE candidates. Back when it was oral, this gentleman came to my seminar after he had already failed. And he came to my seminar and he had a lot of experience. He had like 15 years of construction administration experience. And he says that's the section that he failed in the oral exam before coming to my seminar, because he answered everything the way he's done it in the real world. And that's not necessarily, especially when we're talking about construction, it's all about the A201, the general conditions. Everything follows from that. And oftentimes, things in the real world don't follow the A201. So if he's answering based on his own experience, yeah, he's going to fail.
That's what clued me into it, that this thing was happening over and over and over again, was because the people that were suffering from this the most were the ones that, oddly enough, had the most experience.
Yes.
Like the CA guy that has been doing it for 15 years and he failed the CA portions of the exam. Right. How is that even possible?
Exactly.
Oh, it's because of this self-centric bias. He's framing everything in terms of his own experience, and it's not working. That's not what NCARB is testing you on. NCARB doesn't know you, as I've said multiple times. You need to demonstrate to NCARB that you're a responsible professional, not that you have a lot of experience.
Well, and that's, NCARB says this, California Architects Board says this for their exam. They're basically looking for entry-level competence. They're not saying we have to be in the profession for 10 years. So all of this can be learned. And the self-centric bias, I wish we mentioned this one earlier on, because this is the one I think in my mind that drives it home. That's like, oh, this is how my own biases can lead to my detriment, right? Because I'm just throwing from my own experience. This is how I'm going to answer this question. From my own experience, this is how I'm going to answer this question. And that's not what it's about. You got to remove yourself from that.
Yeah, it's not about you.
Exactly.
That was, by the way, every company I've ever worked for, when I've rallied the crew, I say this to my grad students now too at BAC, which is, it's not about you. It has nothing to do with you. Stop being so damn selfish. It's about the mission that we're on. It's about the project. It's about the thing. Which is probably
the most hurtful words anybody wants to hear. It's not about you. Because it's like, what do you mean it's not about me? It's kind of that enlightened moment. Like, oh yeah, it's not about me, because we all think it's about us. That's our ego.
Exactly. And then there's one more huge bias, and this one will keep you up at night if you just took the test and didn't pass. And I call it the compounded backfire, is what I call it. I don't know what else to call it, but it's basically when you don't correctly understand some aspect of something. Maybe it's in the contracts or in the code, and then it leads you to getting several items in a row wrong because your mind is doubling down on that aspect.
Right.
And I've told this story before, but it wasn't until I studied for the California supplemental exam that I learned that punch lists are the responsibility of the contractor. Right. Because of who I work for, I had 3 firms in a row that the architects were doing the punch list, so I just assumed it was our responsibility. And God knows how many questions I got wrong in the ARE about that because I was so dead set the punch list must be the responsibility of the architect, that I probably encountered questions that didn't make sense to me if that was true, but yet I refused to switch.
Well, here's I wish we started the show with these 3, because these are great. Not that the others weren't, but hopefully listeners are hanging in there long enough to get to these, because this is actually the nugget of the show. But I give an example at my CSC seminars, contract administration. It's exactly what you're talking about. Because I say, you have to understand the A201, you have to understand the general conditions. It lays out how everything works during construction. I said, for example, there's probably 2 or 3 key concepts in the A201 that if you understand those 2 or 3 key concepts, you can answer 30 questions just from understanding those 2 or 3 concepts.
Absolutely.
And just like you said, if I don't understand one of the concepts, that's going to have a domino effect of questions I answer incorrectly.
But what's funny is if you think that through even further, what was that book by it was the Brad Pitt movie about baseball with the Oakland A's?
Moneyball? Was that
about
Moneyball?
How they pick players?
Moneyball?
Yeah. Moneyball. And then it was a great book by what's his name? And then he also wrote The Big Short.
Right.
If you think about it, if you were unsure about a certain concept in contracts or code or something, theoretically it would be almost better for you to answer one question one way and one question another in order to hedge your bets, hoping that you get one of them right, as opposed to answering 30 questions in a row all with the wrong assumption.
Right.
But I don't know if that would start to just drive everybody insane or not.
Yeah, that's not a new strategy, but yeah, that would be an interesting one.
So here, this was the nugget of it. But now we've got this list of how to overcome these biases. Well,
but I want to get back to, let's talk about the 3 big ones we just did. What were they? What was the first one?
Project type bias.
Project type, and then self-centric.
And then what I called the compounded backfire.
Okay, so let's say I have those 3 biases, or I have one of those 3 biases, and maybe we all have them. It's just, what do we do with them? Like, how do we keep them at bay on exam day? So how do we keep those 3, or any one of those 3, from rearing its ugly head and being detrimental to me on exam day? What can I do?
So one thing, and I'm advising candidates to do this, is almost keep a prototypical project in your mind. And under 5.0, with the case studies they give you, that makes it a lot easier, obviously. But on the exam, when they're asking you a question, almost have like a typical project in your mind, and ideally one that you're not doing every day. So if you are doing healthcare renovations all day, maybe in your mind you're imagining a 3-story commercial office building located on a suburban lot instead as the prototypical, project. And then when you're asked that question, think of it through that type of building.
That's a good point, because one of the candidates in the CSC seminars, this is when it was oral, so several years ago, he came in after he didn't pass. He came to my seminar, and he said he had a crime lab. And he said, because he hadn't done a crime lab before, he didn't have experience in a crime lab, he failed. And I explained to him.
Yeah, that's the reason.
Exactly. But that's his bias, right? I said, we're architects, we're smart. Whatever the project type is, doesn't really matter as long as we're applying the same principles, like you were just saying. Like one of the questions was, name 3 systems that you need to be concerned with in the evidence room. Okay, I've never done a crime lab before, but 3 systems, evidence room. Well, I know that the evidence it can't get wet, it can't get too humid, so we have to have some kind of humidity control. Probably need some easy to clean surfaces on the bench when they cut shit open and all that stuff. So it's like you just have to stop your mind and just think about it, because we're smart. Like we know whether we have experience in that project type or not, we know the systems, we know how it is, whether we've done it or not is irrelevant in some respects.
Also, think about what you're doing now. You're faced with this crime lab. I don't even know. I mean, I've never worked on a crime lab in my life. I probably never will. But suddenly now I'm going from trying to remember, which is one aspect of my brain, to a much more creative exercise of, a crime lab.
Right.
Yeah. God, they probably have to, they probably have microscopes and stuff. So they probably need like a lot of electrical outlets, and they probably need those scientific tables with that black stone top. And, suddenly it's activating a different part of my brain that I'm better at, which is creativity. And so I'd have an easier if I imagine a building that I don't do, as opposed to I do healthcare renovation all day. I'm going to look at everything through that lens, and I'm going to try to remember, what did we use on those projects again? It's almost about activating different pathways in your brain to really get you to get to the right answer. You
know what it is? And I was mentioning this a little while ago about this whole process seems like it's like a Buddha or it's a Zen moment, where you got to question number 8 comes in, process it, release it, exhale it out. Question number 9 comes in. It's actually what we're talking about. And what you were just mentioning demonstrated that. If I go into, what was that material I used before? We're in the past. We're out of the present. We're not in the present moment. But like you were just saying before that, crime lab. Well, I haven't done one, but let me think about that. Like I'm now in the present moment of trying to figure out what's in a crime lab. So it's like the past versus the present.
Yeah, and we're much better at the present.
Much better
generally
at the present.
as architects. Yeah.
Well, and also think about it. For the exam, the present is always going to win. If we're focused on each question as it comes, rather than thinking about, 3 questions ago I missed that one and I'm not sure, and now I suck and there's 3 in a row I just missed, and now it's carrying over to 5, and we're just dwelling in the past rather than just inhaling one question, exhaling it, letting it go, and moving on to the next.
Exactly. I've got more tips. Okay.
Yeah. What do we got?
Second, remember that you have to earn points in this test. It's not like the SATs where you start with 400 or whatever. You start with 0, and each item is a chance for you to demonstrate that you are a responsible professional and rack up those things. So it's not about you. It's not about your fear. It's about you proving yourself. And if you go in with that idea that each question is a chance for me to earn another point, that too is a bit of bias, right? You're not losing points because you're starting with 0. You're gaining points. So that's another kind of tip in terms of how to start thinking it through. You nothing to say about that?
Yeah, no, that was good. You covered that one.
Okay. Third is, and this one comes up all the time, but it really is a good tip to overcome these biases, is just remembering what is the context I'm in. What division is this again? Where am I? What? And if you're being asked a mechanical question in PPD, which is really schematic design, that is totally different than being asked a mechanical question in PDD, which is really construction documents. And so there's a really juicy bit of information that I'm asking a mechanical question because we talk about mechanical systems differently in schematic design than we do in CDs. And so remembering that context is really critical to you understanding what is NCARB looking for here.
I would agree with that.
Okay. Fourth.
What else you got?
Fourth, and this one I really want to expand upon, this podcast topic, which is looking for the clue words inside the question or the hints within the question. I've heard you say this many times to candidates, right? If the question has the word water in it, what should be happening in your brain is almost like a muscle memory of water. That means floodplain. That means foundation depth. That means soil type, water table, frost line. Like, that one word water in the question should start triggering potential reactions from us or things that we might need to address. Same as when you see the word wind. If they're asking about wind, what they're really asking is noise, colds, temperatures, and blocking with trees or screening with buildings. If the question is about the contractor discovers blank during whatever, your muscle memory should kick in and go, that change orders, owner architect responsibilities, who signs off on the change order. So you're looking for those clue words because they'll give you insight into what NCARB's really after there for the answer.
I'll give you a good example of that. So one of my favorite questions is, I've been asking this one for 7 years. It's one of my favorites because it always splits the room. If I have 30 people in there, 15 people will get it wrong. And the question is, how does a high water table affect the design? That's it. How does a high water table affect the design? And one of the answers is requires the contractor to remove water during, foundation. Half of the people, consistently, every seminar I do this, almost half of the people choose that answer. Because, and I'll usually choose somebody who chose that answer. I said, okay, read the question to me again, and they'll read it, and then they'll read it, and then it's like, okay, what is it on the end? The word design. It's not asking how it's affecting construction. Just how is it affecting design? The question couldn't be simpler. How does a high water table affect the design? That's simple. There's no mystery there. I lost you again. Are you back?
Yeah.
Hold on. Okay. So there's no mystery there, yet consistently, every single seminar, half of the people choose the contractor has to remove the water. They're just reading too fast. They're answering before they really understand the question.
And also probably some sort of cognitive bias comes in. If you were to drill down with those people, what do you what is your project experience? What do you do all day? It's probably more on the redlining CA type side.
Well, actually, to your point,
than like maybe detailing a wall and waterproofing.
To your point, a majority of CSC candidates are older. They're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Typically, and so they're bringing a lot of that. Oh my God! My phone is going off, and you're getting a poor connection. All right, but they're bringing a lot of that construction experience, which would be their bias, to that question. And the question is, how does a high water table affect the design? I don't know. Is there 8 words in there? 10 words? And there's nothing confusing about the question, but consistently, contractor has to remove water during construction.
Couldn't be more clear.
No. So and that's what I tell candidates too, and you've probably run into this. I'm sorry you failed. Nobody likes to fail, but it's probably not. You probably didn't fail because of the hard questions. You probably failed because you just misinterpreted the easier ones, and I think that's true.
Yes.
Nobody wants to hear it.
No. No. Which is, it's funny. Half the candidates I talk to, and it is about half, give me some version of, I'm not a good test taker. I don't read so good. I'm not good with words. And they're using it as a bias and as an excuse, and it's also affecting their mindset too. But it's like, no kidding. That's why you probably became an architect. We are visual people. So what I tell them to do is, if you really feel this is blocking you, take that scratch paper they give you and then diagram the question. Take the question and almost break it into a little pictogram. This, by the way, is how I got through AP Physics in high school, was using this method. So it's actually really helpful. The other thing is, if you're a visual person, when you get the question, say it out loud. I mean, not loud because you're in a testing center, but like kind of whisper it to yourself, because then it'll be going in your eyes and your ears at the same time and open up some of those pathways to the brain so you can start thinking about the question in a much better way. Plus, you'll hear that word, water on the site, or wind, or whatever that keyword is, and it'll help you clue into what they're really looking for there.
And I love that advice, actually. And what that gets to is what I mentioned earlier, is about just being present, being in the present, being present with a question. So whether I am, choosing to diagram it out on a piece of paper, or I'm choosing to, whisper it to myself, so I'm hearing it, you're engaging with the question. You're becoming present with it. That's the key.
Well, what I discovered is a lot of candidates, when they were taking when they were studying or taking the exam simulator, they would read the question out loud at home. And then when they got into the test, they didn't, because they're in a testing center, and so they're freaked out, and they're struggling. And so that's kind of what clued me into it. And so I love that idea of whispering it. And really, it works the same way the audio companion works. They would be hearing the question in their ear as opposed to just through their eyes. And the same people that report that they can hear your voice, from the audio companion when they're in the center, I was saying the question, it'll start to trigger other words, and they'll get that muscle memory that we have been training them for. Exactly.
Alrighty, well, I think we covered a lot in this our first episode of 2018. So on our current schedule, look for our next episode probably in May. Does that sound right, Eric?
No. We're going to do these every week. 52 episodes is my goal for the year.
I think we're going to be season 3, episode 1 we'll release in May. How is that? Yeah, no, we're going to every week this year. Let's do it, 2018. And we're recorded, so now we have to, because, people can come back and say, hey, you said you're going to do it at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, we'll get angry letters if we don't.
Alrighty, well, on behalf of Eric Corey Freed, my name is David Doucette. This has been the ARE Podcast, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.